Dana.
Right. All right, so here is the deal as we get started this morning. Tonight is the night that I have my big webinar with the College Board and Trevor Packer and all those people. And I will have lots of information for you on Friday about what your exam is going to look like, including how you're going to log in, when the practice test is going to be available. All of that stuff I will have to share with you on Friday. So, or even tomorrow. I could post it on the Teams page if anybody's super duper curious about it. But I will get all of those updates tonight, and then we will be ready to go for tomorrow, for Friday. Okay, so you'll have all those updates by then. So today we are going to jump right into talking about, talking about the Industrial Revolution today.
14 episodes, so it just feels weird.
What?
I missed my fake white wall. Stuck with my real white wall.
Can anybody hear that?
Yeah. This week in history.
Yes, we can hear that.
What is that?
Mussolini's corpse.
I don't know, but he likes his fake
Playing
wall.
video.
My dog. Okay, well that was weird. I don't know who that guy was. Did we get Zoom bombed? No. It's just you guys. I don't know.
That's a thing.
You've never heard of that
Yeah.
before?
Yeah.
Zoom bombing.
When
You ever
random
seen his
people
AP
jump
seminar
in and
video?
just,
Anyway, that was odd. So we are talking about the Industrial Revolution today, which is some of your favorite topics, although the person I know whose favorite topic it is, she's not here today. But it is important topic. So we're not going to talk about all of the Industrial Revolution today. I don't want you to think we're going to get to everything. We're just going to kind of do an overview. There is more to the Industrial Revolution than just today's lesson. We're not really going to have time to go over it. But you'll be reading about it this week when you do your review. So you'll get it all again anyway. But I don't want you to think that this is the only Industrial Revolution topic. There is more to it. We just don't have time to go over every aspect of the Industrial Revolution this morning. So there is the objective, talking about how the environmental factors contributed to industrialization during this period. Now, there's actually a couple of different objectives that we'll pop onto as we go through this. This is just one of them. Okay, but there are actually other objectives that will come up today as well. Now, important opening thought sort of as we start this lesson for you to remember is that obviously industrialization is going to fundamentally change how goods are produced, how they are consumed, and then what even constitutes a good, right? So what does that mean exactly? Well, that means, you know, for the first time, as you're going to see today, we're going to begin to see products being offered on a mass or a large scale for consumption. Okay, we're going to see the end of these cottage industries and the move towards more factory labor, okay, producing goods on a mass scale for consumption. Now, you're also going to see how the Industrial Revolution affects, obviously, the global economy, but also the societal structure. Okay, we're going to talk about the creation of a new social class, okay, and what changes that had to culture as well as to society. But the big takeaway from this that I want you to remember is that the Industrial Revolution didn't happen quickly. Okay, this is a gradual change. It starts within Europe, specifically London, and then begins to fan out from there. Okay, but it's not just confined to Europe, and it's not obviously just confined to London. It does eventually become a truly global movement, but understand that that happens slowly and over the course of almost 2 centuries. Okay, so this is not like one day somebody flips a switch and boom, industrialization. Okay, it is a slow and rather gradual change. And there also are people who were very much against it, like Gandhi. Okay, and this quote here from him kind of, you know, it explains what his objections to it were. And basically, you know, there are people who feel or who felt like industrialization kind of just, you know, kind of led to the destruction of the earth in terms of the environment. We were stripping the planet of its resources at a rather fast rate. So also understand as we go through this today that not everybody was in favor of this industrialization, okay? Also, a couple things to keep in mind is that the Industrial Revolution is aided by cities being close to waterways so that there were access to these rivers, access to these bodies of water, which allowed people to move goods faster and cheaper, okay? The availability of three very important natural resources, coal, iron, and timber, okay? A movement towards moving out of the country and into the cities, what we refer to as urbanization, obviously. Better agricultural technology, so better farming. Okay, now you're probably wondering or remember, well, what does farming have to do with this? And we'll get into that later. Okay, access to foreign resources by way of colonies, right? So the fact that all these industrialized nations are establishing all of these colonies means that they have access to the resources that are in those colonies. And then finally, accumulating funds, okay, accumulating money, capital. Okay, so having the money to be able to do this, okay? Prior to 1750, most of our industries are what we call cottage industries, which is exactly what it sounds like. These people are working out of their homes, so they are producing a very, very, very small number of product, mostly designed for their own family or being sold on a very small scale to their neighbors in their villages. Okay, that's the industry prior to 1750. After 1750, as we begin to move to more of an industrial model, okay, now we are moving into a factory model where goods are being produced on a large scale for consumption, okay? And so what does that look like? Well, it means we're starting with a merchant, right, who's going to a bank, okay, to get money, okay? And then maybe that merchant sets up a sheep farm, okay? Now, that sheep farmer, okay, is involved with three other farmers, okay? And this is in the cottage industry, by the way. So that sheep farmer is involved with three other farmers who do all different sorts of things, okay, with the wool, okay? Then at some point, those farmers go back to the merchant, okay, to gain their own capital to sell that product, okay? Eventually, the merchant is the one who takes it to the market. And so in this system, you are involving all of these different groups of people, okay? Now, prior to that, okay, or rather prior to industrialization, under that system that I just described to you, okay, you're seeing farmers using three field systems which aren't producing that many crops. It's an extremely inefficient system, okay? And the kind of irony about that is that during the Middle Ages, it was considered to be a very efficient system. It was considered to be revolutionary. By 1750, it's very outdated. Okay, there's not a lot of experimentation going on, and so food production is kind of limited at this time. Now, what does that mean? Well, because the food production's limited, the size of the population then is also going to be limited. And so what you are seeing happen is the population is being kept in check by the availability of food, okay? However, that all begins to change in the middle part of the 1700s. And so now what we're seeing for the first time is a significant movement to use new farming techniques, new agricultural methods to increase the amount of agricultural output. One example of that is something called the enclosure movement, where people literally build fences to protect their farmlands. Prior to this, if you recall, these fences weren't used and everybody just kind of shared. Okay, now everybody's like, no, that's my land. I'm gonna put up a fence to keep out Kayla and her cows from eating all my grass, okay? And if you look over this period, okay, you can see how the use of enclosures or how the use of fences increased during this time period, okay? We're also beginning to see more crop rotation, which will help increase production, okay? And then, of course, the introduction of those new crops that I mentioned to you last week when we talked about the Columbian exchange, so corn and potatoes, which are both crops that have a very high yield, that are also extremely cheap to produce. Okay, and then new plows. Okay, new technology called the seed drill, which make agriculture a lot more efficient. So these new tools and these new farming methods and these new crops greatly increase the output. Okay, and so it's important to note that this new agricultural revolution precedes the industrial revolution. So if you're writing about the industrial revolution and you're looking for context, okay, how did we get to this point? Okay, talking about the new agricultural revolution would be a great way to do that. So if you know, we get lucky and your DBQ topic happens to be about industrialization, this is a great way to help establish context, or even depending on what the actual question is, using outside evidence or possibly even complexity. Okay, so this is an important bit of information for you to know. The Industrial Revolution itself, okay, we know that it starts in Britain. Okay, this is without a doubt, this is a, you know, it begins within Britain and then fans out from there. And more specifically, we know that it starts in London. Okay, it does owe a lot of its ideas and a lot of its early developments to the events of the scientific revolution, meaning that some of those technologies and some of those inventions greatly assisted the Industrial Revolution. So there is some overlap between those two things, okay? It shifts people out of the rural areas into the more urban areas, into the cities, and causes things to become more specialized, okay? So you might have a factory that's only producing one particular good, okay? Now to us nowadays, that might seem like common sense, but back then it wasn't, okay? And so we are moving away from that cottage industry system into the factories. Now, the big question then is, well, why did it start in Great Britain? What was it about Britain that made the conditions so ripe for this to happen? Okay, and there are a few different reasons. At the top of that list, of course, is going to be the availability of natural resources. Britain had plenty of coal. In addition to being an island, Britain is a country where there are a lot of natural waterways already, which means it's very easy and cheap and quick to move goods around. Okay, they're also conveniently located in that they have easy access to the sea, okay, to the larger bodies of water. So in particular, in this instance, to the Atlantic Ocean, okay? They also had a large, fairly educated and very skilled labor force. Okay, so those are all resources that they had prior to the Industrial Revolution beginning. Now, some other conditions that are going to be very, very important here is that there is a population explosion, okay, owing to the agricultural revolution. So the size of the population gets bigger, which means suddenly there's all these people who need access to products, as well as suddenly there is a larger labor force that's able to provide it. Okay, so the booming population does two things. One, it creates demand, and two, it creates a labor force. The economy was doing very, very well, which means these people had money to start businesses. The government was extremely stable. There was no threat of a coup or the government being overthrown. Okay, it was a very stable, very orderly government. Ships were protected by the strongest and at the time the best navy in the world. Okay, there was a great deal of encouragement from the government to start these kind of businesses and to become entrepreneurial. Okay, and then there was more fluidity and more movement among social groups than you saw in other parts of Europe. So all of these conditions collectively, you know, are kind of reasons why historians believe that the Industrial Revolution really does begin within England. Now, this is not a be-all, end-all situation. There are lots of historians who will argue that, in fact, the Industrial Revolution actually started in China over a century before, okay, or started in the Muslim empires, okay, about a century and a half before. So There is some debate, but I would say the general consensus, and it's the point of view that I fall in line with, is that it does begin for these reasons in Great Britain. Okay, now we know that we owe a lot of this to agriculture, right? Okay, and so these better farming techniques, okay, are certainly going to assist with industrial revolution, because what happens is they're keeping the food prices down. So things like better fertilizer and crop rotation and better seeds, inventions like the cotton gin and the seed drill, etc. All of these different things, number one, kept food prices low. So people now, for the first time in quite a while, probably since the Renaissance, they had disposable income. Okay, and there weren't as many people needed to work on the farms. These machines did the job of a lot of laborers for them, which means that it was suddenly a lot cheaper. Okay, or there was suddenly less of a need for these laborers, and so now these people who used to work on the farms, they had no jobs, and so they began to look for work elsewhere, which is what's going to cause the movement and the migration into the cities for these people to go work in the factories. Okay, so why did the population increase? Few different reasons. Okay, number one, there was more food, which means there was not a risk of famine. Because they had brought over a lot of new food sources from the New World, things like, again, corn, okay, and potatoes, the people had better diets for the first time. They were healthier. Because they were healthier and because medical care had gotten better, they finally realized that when you get sick, the solution is not to drain out the bad blood. Okay, so medical care gets better, so they're no longer bleeding you when they think that you're sick. I don't know, maybe they're telling everyone back then to drink bleach instead, who knows. Hygiene gets better, okay, sanitation gets better, and so all of these things. Now, ironically about sanitation is that once they move to the cities, it's going to get significantly worse. But prior to all of that, okay, these factors are going to lead to a much larger population. How much bigger? Well, in Great Britain, from 1700 to 1800, the population grows by 4 million, from 5 million to 9 million. Now, that means that the birth rate, okay, is actually much higher than that, because you have to factor in deaths for various reasons, including old age, but the actual birth rate, right, would be significantly higher than 1 million, okay, or than 4 million rather, because you are accounting for deaths, okay? Worldwide, you can see the population continuing to increase. Notice that this goes all the way up to today, okay? So right now we are somewhere between 7 and 8 billion people. By 2024, we are projected to be at 8 billion worldwide. By 2048, we're projected to be at 9 billion. So the world's population is continuing to increase, okay? And you can see even it is increasing now at a much more exponential rate than it was during the Industrial Revolution, okay? And part of this, okay, probably this first exponential jump comes from the baby boom after World War II, okay, which probably explains why you have a slower increase here between 1927 and 1960, which are the two metrics that we have, because I would venture a guess that between 1939 and 1945, you would see a slight loss, or at the very least a flattening of this curve because of deaths during World War II, okay? And then once the war ends and we get into the baby boom, you are gonna see it, like you see here, begin to exponentially shoot up, okay? Which is probably something similar to what you will see happen now after the quarantine ends, okay? I feel like we're, in about 9 months from now, we're probably gonna have a lot of quarantine babies being born. Okay, so to give you an idea of individual cities in Great Britain, how their populations go up. Now notice I specifically chose a graphic that did not include London, because I think if you look at the numbers for London, they would be very misleading, because in 1801, London's population was already well over 1 million people. And so I didn't want you to look at that chart and say, well, yeah, they were already living there. Look at these other cities within England, okay? These are important cities and large cities, but obviously not to the level that London is. But look at how they grow during the 1800s. So the city of Birmingham jumps from 74,000 at the beginning of the century to over 500,000 by the end of the century. Okay, Manchester, which is an important city if you're a soccer fan, okay, jumps from 90,000 at the beginning of the century to 645,000, just before the end of it. So these, it's not just London, okay, which is why I chose this particular graphic, so that you realize that it's happening in more places than just London, okay? And again, it's not just happening within Europe. Take a look at the populations here of these American cities, okay? Look at, you can see obviously at the beginning here in 1860, New York City, okay, has a population of just over 1 million. 40 years later, by 1900, their population's over almost 3.5 million people, okay? Worldwide, you can see, or no, this is also in the US. So you can see in the United States, in the period following the Civil War, look at how many people over time begin moving to cities. So in 1860, okay, notice how populations of people within cities increase. In a decade, it goes from 6.2 to 9.9, then it goes up to 14 million. Eventually, by 1920, by the end of World War I, you've got 54 million people living in cities and 51 million people living outside of the city, okay? So you can see what these population increases look like. Okay, so what about the technology? How did technology shape production? Well, we know that there's a whole bunch of them. You don't have to know how all of these work specifically. Okay, just know that these were all machines that made it faster, cheaper, and easier to produce certain goods. Okay, so I would think we probably all know what the cotton gin is. Okay, but then you've got a whole set of these other inventions. And again, it's not important that you know what all of them do. I don't know what all of them do. Most of them have to do with textiles, have to do with cloth. Okay, making cloth products out of cotton. But the big takeaway from all of them is that they made it cheaper and faster to produce these goods, okay? And so along with this, we are seeing a shift, right, in where people are getting their energy from. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, if you wanted to run a business, okay, you had to rely on a power source that was usually provided in most cases by water. So we know that the earliest factories are powered by water, right? Okay, they had to be built along the river and they had the giant wheel. Smaller factories, they required wood to burn as a source of heat, okay? And then if you were a farmer, you relied on good old manual labor, either provided by you or some other person or an animal, okay? During the Industrial Revolution, coal, oil, and natural gas begin to replace all of these, okay? This means that we have these very powerful machines, okay? And it means that if we're generating more energy, we could increase production, which would result in more output of goods, okay? And it's going to increase 50 times, energy output, that is going to increase 50 times in the period between 1750 and 1900. So these new sources of energy are also leading to a lot more efficient output, okay? We also begin to see other technology as well because of the new energy sources. So now that we can power machines using more than just water and fire, Okay, now we can develop new inventions are going to come out of that next. And so one of them would be the steam engine, okay, which is the big one. That changes everything, right? Once people realize that you could power machines using steam, okay, suddenly all of these other inventions are going to follow that are going to use steam as a source of power, okay? Using coal, okay, so burning coal, which is how you get the steam, okay, burning coal makes the iron a lot better, and the iron, with this increased quality of the iron that you're making, because you're able to get it hotter, and so you're able to melt it down and mold it better. With that iron, that iron gets used to make a lot of the parts of these different machines. Okay, iron is also used in buildings for the first time, and bridges, okay, are also made of iron. You're also seeing taller buildings, okay? Some of our first skyscrapers, okay? And again, another reason why Britain is so well positioned to take advantage of this. Look at the map here. The red areas are areas in Great Britain where there are coal mines, okay? And so as you can see, they are plentiful. There are lots of different areas within Great Britain where they could go mine for coal. Now, take a look at this graph here, and you can see how much of the energy in Great Britain is being provided by coal. Look at how much of their energy is being provided by coal between 1850 and 1859. Okay, I would say that's well over 80%, probably bordering on 90%. Okay, but you can see how that had increased exponentially over time. Also notice that the human labor is pretty flat. It's not exactly flat, but for the most part, it's pretty flat, okay? Now, compare that to Italy, okay, which we know during the 1500s and the 1600s was a very wealthy country, okay? And look at Italy's output, okay? First of all, look at how much less energy they are generating, and look at how little of it comes from coal. Most of their energy is coming from wood, okay? Just plain old burning wood, okay? And so this is, again, this is after this, okay? This is how far behind England, Italy was at the time. So it should give you an idea of just how much more advanced England or Great Britain was than the rest of the world, okay? And so yes, notice how much less firewood they are using. Now, this means that you need a labor source for the coal mines. And as Kayla Edwards loves to point out to me, okay, children are the ideal labor source for working in the mines. And as she once told me back when we were in school, she said that that was good for kids to go to work because it taught them the value of hard work, and it taught them that nothing would be given to them. And it's a very interesting perspective. Kayla, did you want to chime in about that? I know this is a topic that's very, very important to you.
Yeah, I remember I said that it helps them become contributing people to the society, and I think it's really good for them to be working. However, they aren't going to school, which is kind of not cool, but at least if they're not doing school, they're doing something else. And I really support that. I vibe with them. I think they're doing a great job.
Thank you. See?
You're
Okay.
welcome.
And so yes, so the coal mines did rely rather heavily on child labor, okay? And Mika commented, she's not wrong. Kids these days are up in their rooms playing Xbox or Roblox until 5 o'clock in the morning. Mika, you sound like your parents, or you sound like every parent ever when you say kids these days. So child labor was used extensively in the coal mines, and that's for a lot of reasons. Okay, now some people will tell you that children were used in the coal mines because it was small spaces. It was easier for them to move around in the mines. And while that's true to a very small extent, what you need to understand is that the main reason that kids were used for the coal mines is not because they were smaller and could maneuver better. It was because they could pay them less, okay? Children worked for significantly less wages than the adults did. And so please understand that this was a mostly economic decision, okay? Some people will try to justify it by saying, oh, they're smaller and they can get in and out faster. Okay, that wasn't the case. This was all about money. This was about paying children less money. Now, the coal mines, for very obvious reasons, right? These were dangerous places to be, okay? There was a very high rate of death because when you went down into the mines, there was the constant threat of the mine caving in or collapsing at any moment. There was no system put in place to prevent that. And so if that did happen, you were pretty much left for dead, right? There was not a whole lot that they could do to you. There's also the fact that you were spending 12 to 14 hours a day underground, breathing in coal, okay? And so, the air quality is not exactly the best, okay? And it was leading to a lot of lung diseases, okay? Lung cancer being one of them, although they didn't know that that's what it was at that point. So basically you have children spending their days down in these mines who are essentially, suffering the same effects that somebody that has smoked for 30 years has. And so, they would develop what they called black lung, okay, which is what happens when you're breathing in all of that awful air all day long underground. You're not getting a whole lot of fresh air. And this is going to be one of the things that's going to lead us eventually towards a move for workers' rights, and then later on for the rights of children who are engaging in labor, okay? Now, the steam engine, okay, is going to dramatically increase how much of the world's manufacturing is done by the British. And so if you look during this time period of 1750 to 1900, look at how the percent of the world's manufacturing that gets done by the United Kingdom, by Great Britain. It's the light blue. And then compare that also to another nation that is industrializing at a very fast rate, the United States. And so you can see that their shares of the world's manufacturing output begins to increase rather dramatically. Whereas a country like Italy, okay, which had kind of brushed all this aside and said, no, it's a fad, this is never going to stick. Notice that the amount of manufacturing Italy does stays fairly stagnant, okay? In the United States, and also within England, I just happened to find a map of the United States, you're going to see railroads being built during this time period as well. Railroads are a sign of industrialization. When you're in the United States and you don't have the extensive waterways that the British had, they had to be able to move goods in other ways. And so take a look. This is pre-Civil War. Okay, so notice in 1830, there's barely any railways. There's a couple of small local lines up in Pennsylvania and a couple in Maryland. Okay, a decade or so later, you are seeing, again, the expansion of the railways. Still not a significant amount of rail lines. But then look what happens in that decade. And by 1850, we're seeing a much more extensive network of rails in the United States. And this is happening also in Great Britain, although not on as large a scale, because Britain had all those rivers and those canals, and they could still move most of their goods by water. Now, this is a decade later in 1860, okay? So this is just on the eve of the Civil War. Look at how much even more extensive that line has gotten. You could pretty much get from Florida all the way up into Maine traveling by rail, okay? And you could get as far west as the end or the edge of Missouri, okay? And maybe even a teeny bit into Texas. I'm not sure which is further west. So railway lines, right? Certainly going to serve as evidence of industrialization, because it's showing that you have the capability to move goods from place to place. And I also want to point out to you too, notice even the southern states had fairly extensive rail lines. And so even the part of the country at the time that was not manufacturing, they were still moving goods around on these rail lines, because the products that they farmed had to get up north somehow too. So don't mistake the fact that, yes, while it was not on as large of a scale, the South still built railroads in order to move goods out, agricultural goods, as well as import manufactured goods, okay? And here's what the railway system looks like in Europe, okay? So here is another map. Now, the green lines are the railroads that were built within Europe by 1850, okay? By the end of the decade, so by 1890, we've added the red rail lines. And so you can see again how much more extensively the use of rails increased throughout Europe by the end of this century, okay? Now, we have another industrial revolution, what they call the second one, okay? The second industrial revolution that happens in the latter half of the century. This is where you're going to see things change within the factory. So the first industrial revolution was everybody moving out of the farms into the factories, okay, producing goods on a large scale. Now we're going to see how they make that even bigger, okay? And so during the second industrial revolution, we are going to see the growth of the steel industry, okay, the railroads, which we already talked about, okay? We're also going to see electricity being used for the first time, okay? As well as petroleum, which is oil, and then even steel, okay? This revolution, this second half of the revolution, is also when we start to talk about new social groups like the middle class. And so if we think about what the social structure or the social pyramid within England would have looked like at the time, it's going to look something like this. At the very top of the social pyramid are the aristocrats, okay? These are still the people with some kind of noble blood in them. That's still a thing within England even today, okay? They made up at the time about 5% of the population, yet they made most of the decisions. Underneath them, making up about 15% of the population, was the middle class. Now, do not misunderstand this. The middle class was extremely wealthy. They just didn't have any royal or any noble blood, so they couldn't move up to that top group, okay? But they were very, very wealthy, and they lived in nice houses, they had good jobs, they had money to spend on places like museums and the theater and the opera, all forms of entertainment that were coming about at the time. And then the vast majority of the population was the working class, okay? Not everybody in the working class was poor. Most of them were, but not all of them. There were like little subgroups within the working class. This was also the group that you're going to see get exploited the most during this time period, okay? And so just like you see on this pyramid here, it is the groups at the bottom, you know, the workers, that are holding up these wealthier people and these richer people. So their lifestyle, okay, is being supported by the workers, okay? Now, the British aristocracy, right, very, very, very little, okay, is going to change for them. They really weren't helped, okay, by the Industrial Revolution. I mean, yes, they benefited from the technology, you know, but beyond that, their lives didn't improve much at all. And in fact, in many cases, they lost power and they lost money because that middle class was now getting their own piece of that wealth. And in many cases, they were just as wealthy, if not wealthier than them. The only thing that they were missing was that family name, okay? Also, they were, most of the aristocracy was in farming. And so most of their money was tied up within agriculture, which was an industry that was not as prevalent during this era. And so the people that were investing in and owning and buying these factories were this new middle class. And so they're gaining all this additional income and power from the factories, while the aristocracy is losing that. Okay, the middle class, this is the group that benefits the most. Okay, this is a new group of people. Okay, many of them are very, very wealthy, like the people that own the factories and own the mines. Okay, a lot of bankers became very, very wealthy, a lot of merchants. These are people that in many cases were just as wealthy, if not wealthier, than the um, aristocracy, but they again didn't have that noble blood. Okay, and so they were very successful financially. Financially, yes, they could compete with the upper class. Okay, most of the people in this group, though, yes, they made a great deal of money, but they weren't dirty, filthy rich. Okay, they had good jobs and they were doing well. They had disposable income. These are going to be people like your doctors, your lawyers, engineers, journalists, teachers, scientists, other professionals. These are like your white collar workers. Okay. Oftentimes you will hear the middle class referred to as the bourgeoisie. Okay, that is a French term that means middle class. The middle class has their own set of values. Okay. First of all, they very much looked down on the poor class, okay, on the working class. And this is a quote that I think sums it up well, and I'm just going to read it to you, okay? They believed that the middle class was as bad off as they were because their misery was voluntary and self-imposed. It was the result of their idleness, their thriftlessness, their intemperance, and their misconduct. So they very much looked down on the lower classes. Okay, things that they valued are going to be hard work. They valued morality. So these are people who tended to be more socially conservative. Okay, they valued being clean. Again, another reason why they looked down on the lower classes, because they came home from work filthy. Okay, and they valued respectability. Okay, just the idea that you had certain values and certain character traits that as a good person, as a gentleman, as a lady, you should hold up. Okay, at the bottom we have the working class, which again, depending on which estimate you are looking at, is going to be anywhere from 70 to 80% of the population. Okay, and so these are the people that work in the mines. These are the people that work on ships in the harbors and in the ports, that work in the factories, that do the building, okay, that are the laborers on the farms. Okay, this is absolutely the group that benefits the least from this. They're not making a lot of money. Okay, yes, they have a job, and they have a job in these factories, but the jobs that they're working, they're forced to work very long hours. They're forced to live in unsanitary homes, as I'll show you in a minute. Okay, and they are dealing with very unsafe working conditions. Okay, it was not uncommon for somebody to die at least weekly in one of the factories. Okay, here's an idea, or here is an example for you of like the kind of homes that they lived in. Okay, so you can see in that photograph, I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people living in that place, and that was it for the entire apartment. Okay, there is no second room off in the back there. That door that you see behind that lady was the door leading out. So that was it. Okay, seven people. Certainly there was no social distancing happening. Okay, so they lived in these tenement houses, and that's what a tenement house looks like from the outside. So you can see that they're lined up like that, very much on top of each other. Okay, the conditions were unsanitary. Okay, there were epidemics popping up all of the time because of not only because of the unsanitary conditions, right, but also because of the terrible sanitation. Okay, there were very few parks that they could go to even get fresh air, because they were right within the middle of the city. So it was just not a good situation for that group of people when they were at home. And it was no better when they went to work. Okay, because when they went to work, the factories that they worked in, again, they worked long hours for very low wages. okay? They engaged in child labor, okay? And there were very, very strict rules that were enforced, okay? You know, in terms of how many hours a day you had to work, how long your breaks could be, okay? And this is eventually going to lead us into these workers wanting to establish or carve out some rights for themselves. And so eventually we're going to see the rise of labor unions and rights for workers, which is eventually going to lead us into socialist and then later communist labor movements. Okay, so that's where that's going to come from. Okay, if you were a woman and you were in the middle class, you were a homemaker and you were expected to be a good wife and mother. Okay, and your job was to create a safe emotional space for your husband, okay, for the man that you were married to. You know, so you were expected to have a nice home for him to come home to at the end of the day, you know, expected to have dinner ready, okay? And so a lot of these ideas you are going to see eventually make their way to the United States after World War II, okay? So kind of a century or so later. Women were expected to be the moral center of the family, okay? And so what does that mean? You know, well, that means that you're expected to live a good life, to be a model for your children of how to act and how to behave, okay? You were the one who was supposed to teach your children how to be respectable, so teaching them manners and things like that. Women did all of the shopping during the day, okay? They didn't have to go to work, okay, because their husbands would have made enough money. Their husbands would have been the sort of sole providers for them, okay? And they were expected to follow what they at the time called the ideology of domesticity. Now, compare that to, okay, oh, and again, here is a comparison that the middle class thought was very apt. On the left, you have a working class woman who, instead of getting her work done, is depicted, right, as sort of taking a nap in the chair. And then on the right-hand side, you have the middle class woman who's working very hard to make dinner for her family. Okay, so even though these women never went to work and didn't work, you know, 12 to 14-hour days in these factories, they still felt like they were the ones who were getting all of their work, you know, who were working hard. Okay, and then these poor women were lazy and were idle. Okay, now working class women, it was very, very different. Okay, because if you were in the working class and you were a woman, you were not working on a farm with your husband, okay? You were going to work in the factories. Or maybe you got lucky enough to be hired on as a servant at one of the middle or the upper class houses, okay? You worked very, very long hours. You spent a lot of time away from your children. You could become injured very, very easily at work. You could get sick, okay? You could lose a limb, you could lose an arm, okay? And you got to do all of this for 1/2 or 1/3 of the salary that a man working the exact same job did, okay? And if you notice, these two charts, okay, show how much males versus females were getting paid, okay? So you can see what the discrepancy is here, okay? But yes, women did go to work, you know, women that had to went to work in these factories, and it was not pleasant for them, okay? And so this very rapid urbanization that we're seeing, then there are drawbacks to this as well, okay? We're seeing a very high rate of poverty, okay? The working class isn't getting any richer, so they're not benefiting from this at all. It's the middle and the upper classes that are benefiting. Pollution is dramatically increasing because these people are all depressed all the time. Crime increases, okay? You're seeing a public health crisis, okay? Because again, disease is on the rise because the sanitation is so awful. There's not enough places for these people to live. Cities don't have infrastructure built to kind of accommodate all these constant moves to the city. So not all of the developments are good, okay? If you're a child laborer, things certainly aren't as good. okay? You're waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, okay? Or rather, no, I'm sorry, you have to be at the factory at 5 o'clock. So you're waking up at 4 or 4:30, okay? You get a lunch break at noon, okay? If you weren't doing your work, they would beat you, okay? You were given a short break for an evening meal, okay? And then your shift, probably ended around 9 p.m. Okay, some people had to stay as late as 11 o'clock, so it was not a good situation. Okay. And so eventually this is going to lead us towards calls for change. People, eventually are going to begin to see just how bad things are, and what this, what kind of like long-term damage this is causing to people. And so we are going to see calls for certain reforms. What kind of reforms eventually come out of this? Okay, one is that we get universal male suffrage, which meant that for the first time, working class men would be allowed to vote. Okay, so they were going to be able to vote. Now, this is a big shift within Great Britain, especially. Okay, because this means that 70 to 80% of the population who previously had not been able to vote could suddenly vote. Okay, and so now you have to take into account their needs and their desires. And so them getting the right to vote leads to things like labor unions, okay, who are going to get together and who are going to fight for workers' rights, which means that they're going to fight for better wages. They are going to fight to get rid of child labor. They're going to fight to make children not have to work, and to mandate school. They are going to fight for the conditions in these factories to be better. All of those things come out of the creation of labor unions, okay? The 8-hour workday that we know today comes from labor unions, okay? And so the idea was, okay, what they call the 8-8-8 rule, which is that you worked 8 hours a day, you slept for 8 hours a night, and you got 8 hours a day for leisure, okay, for rest. They worked to clean up, again, the cities, okay, try to make them more sanitary, okay? So they wanted to get rid of the terrible plumbing issues that they had. They wanted to create open spaces and parks for people to kind of relax and wind down. But you are seeing the working classes during this era beginning to band together, okay, demanding these kinds of things. Okay, and so if you look at these next couple of slides, I'm not going to read them all off to you, but you can see all of the different reforms and all of the different acts that were passed in both Europe and in the United States, okay, that expand rights for the working class. So again, I'm not going to read these all off to you. This first one here, these are all in the United Kingdom. These are all in the United States. These are all constitutional amendments in the United States. Okay, labor rights that are fought for. Again, less child labor. Okay, because before all of these reforms, 2/3 of the people that worked in the textile factories were children, and so they were working in very poor conditions. By 1933 in the United States, there is a minimum wage. In the United Kingdom, it's not till 1998. They also passed laws about working hours. Okay, prior to the Industrial Revolution, children could work anywhere from 11 to 14 hours a day. Many of them during the Industrial Revolution worked 16, but by 1833, that 8-hour rule that I mentioned is passed. They also fought for better health and safety, and again, they formed unions, okay? It's not until 1875 that houses in Great Britain were required to have running water and plumbing, okay? Believe it or not, that took until 1875. And so what was happening before that is sewage is being collected in a bucket, okay, and then it's just dumped out of a window into the streets. As you can imagine, that's not remotely sanitary, okay, and is not a good thing either. And so they were, starting to regulate that. Okay, public education is another thing that comes out of that. It was compulsory in Great Britain, which means it was required beginning in 1880. Okay, so beginning in 1880, you were required to go to school, and the government had to fund it. By 1892, it was recommended in the United States, and by 1910, it becomes compulsory. Okay. Slavery eventually becomes abolished. Okay, in 1833, it is abolished in Great Britain. In 1863, in the United States. Now, notice that Britain makes a couple of exceptions to the Anti-Slavery Act, which is that they could still enslave people in their colonies and in their territories. Okay, so the possessions of the East India Company, okay, and then some of these different islands. And that doesn't get eliminated until 1843. So the British were still allowed for one last decade to enslave people in their colonies, okay? And they get another decade of that. And then again, here is your timeline, and I'm not gonna read all this to you, but here is the timeline for you showing the abolition of slavery, both in Great Britain and the United States, and then ultimately in the world. Okay, notice again here, Great Britain abolishes it in 1833. Okay, you can see that they were not the first. Okay, you can, if you start to go back, you can see France had already banned it, the Netherlands, Sweden, Spain, etc. Okay, and then it's not until 1863 that President Lincoln abolishes it within the United States. Okay, we see Britain, or rather Brazil, Portugal, etc., had already abolished it. Okay, so this sort of is that timeline for you. Okay, and so that brings us to the end. And so now I will ask you what your questions are. Who has a question for me? Anybody? No questions? All right, then if that is the case, we will go ahead and end the call. I will be back with you guys on Friday with a lot of information for you about your AP exams. Oh, wait, a question just popped up in the chat. Oh no, it's just Jorge telling us that OxyClean gets the tough stains out. Yes, indeed it does. So I will be back on Friday with a lot of updates for you about your exam. And we will wrap up Unit 5 on Friday. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, send me an email, message me on Teams, okay, send me a message on Remind, do whatever. Otherwise, have a great day. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like, share, subscribe, and I will see you guys all on Friday. Take good care. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
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 Ta-ta.
Bye.